Hello, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing the 15.11 top lane tier list. So, for general content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were relatively few changes this patch. Most notably, we saw 2 adjustments towards both Aatrox and Garen. We saw a nerf towards Cho'Gath and Smolder, and then a buff towards Ryze and Udyr. It kind of covers the main changes of the patch. Outside of that, we saw system changes towards Horizon Focus, with a cost reduction of 100 and 5 more AP slapped onto the item. Let's get into it. So the D tier is going to consist of the same champions. We have Maokai, who's a pick which has basically kind of faded away from the top lane completely now. It's unfortunate because he did have a pretty decent stint during the end of last season, where he was able to access both Unending Despair and Fimbulwinter when they were in a really strong spot. Both those items have been considerably nerfed since then. Unending is nowhere near as good of a rush option as it used to be. Maokai top has kind of faded away because of that. He's a pick I don't really recommend. He's very low agency and for the most part completely gone from the top lane pool. Udyr got buffed this patch and the buffs were sizable. However, Udyr top was a long way off being like a functional viable pick again. I think this champion still needs more to be functional than the top lane. However, if you're an OTP, I think you can slightly pick this champion back up and maybe make him work in certain spots. I don't think he's suddenly the best option you can lean towards. In fact, I think he is a pretty bad option still, but the buffs were definitely beneficial towards him, albeit some of his core itemization is still definitely weaker to where he was in the previous split/season. The other picks within the D tier are both Nidalee and Smolder. In the case of Smolder, I think as a conditional counter pick into very specific tank matchups where you can use them as a flex and in good comp spots, I think this pick can genuinely be a solid top lane option. That being said, he's in very specific spot. Like you have to play him in very specific spots. I think outside of those spots, you are basically trolling picking him. He will lose to most of the top lane pool and ends up being a pretty heavy resource sink. That being said though, if you can make him work in those right spots, then yeah, this champion can definitely have value. He can scale, and it's going back to the point where Smolder to an extent feels pretty inevitable, but once he hits those breakpoints, he does just access a very large amount of power, and that does give him some genuine value within the top lane. That being said, Nidalee, for Elite, I think she's actually one of the best top lane options you can go to at the moment. I think Nidalee, for like challenge, Grandmaster Challenger level play, it's probably an S, even S plus option. This champion is in an absurdly good spot for the top lane at the moment. That being said though, she is an incredibly hard champion to pilot. What you'll see most of the time, at least for like slightly higher, like above average brackets of play for Nidalee top, is they'll do a decent amount of harassing early on into the game, and then they'll basically fall off and be irrelevant like after 6 for the most part. If you can pilot this pick well, you can egregiously push advantages. You do have to pilot incredibly well, though. I think she is probably the hardest top laner to get value out of at the moment, but if you can get that value, then she is competitively viable and one of the best options to go to. So, if you're willing to sink the time into her, you can. I don't recommend it. It's whatever within the D tier, for relatively similar reasons of why I have Rengar in the D tier in the jungle. Same goes for in the top lane here. Moving on to the C tier, then we lead off with K'Sante, who is not great. He's, ever since his like update where they made him a lot more early game skewed and a bit more stats checky, this champion's once again just struggled to find a spot. I preferred the previous edition of K'Sante because he was just more enjoyable and played more. Like, people liked the older version of K'Sante. That being said, he was like egregious in the way he functioned. The new version of K'Sante is early game skewed, still a competitive problem when he is like above a certain bar. And right now, I think he just needs to be really, like, I think K'Sante as a champion can't really be balanced as an early game tank because he has just too much outplay potential. And an early game tank is always going to be elite skewed or competitive skewed if it is ever in, like, a decent spot for solo queue. K'Sante sits within the C2 at the moment. I don't think the champ's horrible. I think he's bad, though. I just don't think you're going to get as much agency out of him compared to some of the other options, and like, he is difficult to play at the end of the day. Like, you are going to have to put a lot of time into him to get good results. Jace and Rumble, and honestly a lot of the C tier, consists of champions which I think if you play them at a very high level, they are some of the best champions in the game. Jace and Rumble for a while now have dominated competitive, but they're picks I just don't really recommend for solo queue. They leave very little room for error, and if you consistently, or you have times where you just mess up, then these picks will punish you considerably harder than the champions above them. I think if you're very comfortable with them, you can make them work and they can compete with some of the higher tier options. But if you're looking for a pick where you've put maybe 10, 20 games into them, these champions are just not those picks you're looking for. They will underperform compared to the other options within the top lane pool. Gangplank is just a bit weak at the moment. I think there are spots, and if you play him well, he can be decent. I think he's just under the bar at the moment, and if he was to be slightly buffed, I could definitely see him being a competitive B tier option. Right now, though, yeah, sits slightly beneath the bar. Still, though, if you can pilot him well, then you can definitely get value out of him. I don't think he's a terrible champion, just a bit on the weak side. Tom Kench sits within the C tier. Now, Tom is a champion I do think is just weak at the moment. He's suffered direct nerfs, he's suffered heartstone nerfs, and his itemization just isn't in a great spot at the moment. Some of that can be clawed back through the Riftmaker proto-built variation, which I do think is probably just his best core to go at the moment, where you go Heartstone Riftmaker proto-built, or you can go into tank alternatives, but the pick is just not there at the moment. He needs to be pretty far ahead. He's a pretty heavy resourcing, and for where I'd say his best MMR bracket is for average elos, he's just not great. You could argue he's a B tier pick for maybe Emerald below, but once you go Diamond higher, people know how to play against this champion, and he just doesn't have the overloaded amount of damage which he had before to kind of circumvent being a pretty telegraphed champion in his playstyle. Swain, I think, as a counter pick is fine. He's always going to have issues in the top lane where the lane is just really long for him, and champions which can accessibly get onto him or punish him, he will struggle against. He is a relatively squishy champion early on to the game. He's intentionally deflated stats because of the way his passive works, and if you absorb a lot of passive stacks, then you are going to have a higher ceiling than most champions. His health goes low, his base armor, I believe, and magic resist for that matter, are both pretty low as well. And if you find yourself in a difficult matchup, you will be punished for it, which is why I can't really recommend him that consistently as a champion. But in the right spots, I do think he's fine as an option, which is why I do have him as a C tier pick. Alawi's just under the bar intentionally at this point. This champion absorbs a lot of ban rate when she is close to being decent. Right now, though, yeah, she's not in a great spot. This pick could probably do just with an outright update or some sort of changes, because I think a lot of frustration through her kit just comes from her E ability and how certain champions just can't really interact with it, whereas other champions can basically just go just avoid it for the most part and make Alawi's lane just incredibly hard to play. I don't really ever recommend Alawi, but if you're an OTP, I think she's there as an option. I wouldn't even say good. I just think she's there. Nah, I do have him within the C tier. He's a pretty solid elite and competitive option at the moment. I quite like Nah as a counterpick to your Shens and Cassantes. That being said, though, I think he requires a decent amount of time sunk into him. He's not an easy top laner to play by any means, and there are usually just better options for Nah if you just haven't put the time in. If you have, then yeah, I think Nah can be an option there for you. He sits towards the high end of the C tier. I think he is a pretty fine option. And moving on to the B tier, then we lead off with Yone, who definitely suffered a lot more from his W nerfs than I think most people anticipated. Actually, Yone went from being talked about a lot to really not actually being talked about anywhere near as much, because they did those the E change where he's no longer CC immune, he is just unstoppable during the cast. And they gave him some level of compensation by buffing up his crit ratio to now be 100% instead of the 90%, which it was. Overall, he's definitely on the weaker side at the moment. He sits in the B tier. However, I think in counterpick scenarios, you can still get good value out of this champion. And if you're very, very good at piloting him, he's still a very good top laner to lean towards. If you haven't put any time into Yone, I don't really recommend him as an option, but he's there as a pick. Aurora's really lost most of her popularity. This champion's ended up being pretty elite skewed, and I also think long-term Aurora should probably have some level of adjustments done to her to kind of alleviate that elite skew, because there are a lot of average players who just want to play Aurora and kind of enjoy the champion both top and mid, and she just isn't quite there for them. That being said, though, the major item buffs did help her. I think she sits as a solid B tier option. You can kind of opt into different ways of playing her depending on what matchup you're leaning into. There's loads of items accessible to her, like your Storm Surges, your Ludens, your Liandry, your Blackfires, your Malignances even. There's a decent pool of options there. Gwen sits within the B tier, benefited from the item buffs last patch, however, still very, very elite skewed. I think for the most part, most people perceive the Gwen changes as a pretty big failure. This champion has just ended up competitively skewed. Not great for the average player, albeit she is pretty good at the moment, so that is why she sits within the B tier. If she ends up being nerfed for competitive again, though, I imagine she'll drop towards the C tier, and yeah, that'll be unfortunate for the average player base. But right now, I think you can play Gwen and get decent results on her. Ambessa, fine champion for solo queue. I think she has a lot of outplay potential and can be very frustrating for certain champions and matchups. That being said, though, some of the matchups which she can definitely struggle into, like your Renekton's, some of your more stat checky ones, especially in mid to low elo, where like your sets are more popular, for example. Ambessa can also struggle against them, especially if the person piloting Ambessa just isn't as familiar with the champion. She's a good option in Elite and very good and competitive. For solo queue though, I'd say she's a pretty average option you can lean to. You do want to put some games into her though. Volibear, incredibly stat checky but very simplistic kit. This pick kind of revolves around just getting early advantages and kind of just dominating lane through that. If you fall behind on Volibear, this champion can end up being pretty useless. So I would recommend picking him in good spots, making sure you're comfortable playing him from an advantage, and then kind of utilizing him as like that kind of champion where you're just like using him as a stomp champion. Gragas is within the B tier. I think he's a okay option to lean to at the moment. He's not in the strongest spot he's ever been in, but he's fine as a counter pick for the most part. I think his itemization's pretty... Well, some of his itemization has been nerfed, some of it has been buffed to an extent. I mean, Cosmic Drive looks to be his just best first item. You can obviously lean towards Roa, and we've seen Rocket Belt variations pop up a bit more, so I think there is some level of optimization to be done there, but Gragas, yeah, since it's a pretty solid B tier option, I think for an OTP, he should do work for you. If you're not, I think he's a fine pick to lean into. I wouldn't recommend playing him, but I wouldn't recommend against playing him either. Tryndamere. I don't like Tryndamere. He sits in the B tier. I think there's issues, like underlying issues with this champion's kit at the moment, how you can be relatively reliant on just RNG factors early on into the game to kind of like snowball advantages, and if you get those advantages, then Tryndamere can be a very good champion. If you understand your lethal thresholds, I also think this pick can be an incredibly good option to lean towards. If you don't know your lethals, and a lot of the time you just feel like that coin flippy playstyle early on to the game can be quite punishing for you, then I wouldn't really recommend the champion. However, like the Grasp Ravenous build is very, very uninteractive in the way it functions, where you just hit the tower, you sustain off the wave, you kind of just play for siege. You can lean into that as well, and that does alleviate some of the kind of I mean, it's even more stat checky for the most part, but maybe not quite as RNG like focus. It just puts you in a pretty limited kind of playstyle box. Vayne, Varus, some of your ranged options, if you pick them in the right spots and the right compositions, they can be incredibly good. If you pick them in the wrong spots, you can be trolling your team. I think these picks, if you're if you're a Varus player or you're a Vayne player, you're probably an OTP at them for the most part, and you'll pick them in most spots. But I think as like someone, if you're like a tourist of the champion or someone who's put a substantial amount of games into them, they can definitely be good options to lean into if you're playing against like a tank matchup, which you can just really heavily punish and get a lot of resources from. Yasuo sits within the beta. I like Yasuo as a champion. I promote him as a mid laner. I promote him as an ADC, and I honestly promote him as a good counter pick top laner. I think he definitely solidifies himself as a good beta option at the moment. Malphite sits within the beta. I don't like Malphite as much at the moment. I think this pick, if you use him as a counter champion, is fine. Like, he is a good option. Most of the time, though, you're only getting to pick him as like an R5, B4, B5 option, and you want to usually pick something which can have a bit more agency in the game. Malphite is relatively low agency, but can also function relatively low econ. If you're not confident in your ability to stomp lane, then yeah, Malphite can be a good option there for you. But I think he's a bit on the weaker side at the moment, which is why I only promote him as like a beta option. But in in those counterpick scenarios, I do think he can probably be bumped as up as like a solid A tier option. Jax sits within the beta. I think he's fine. I think if you've put the time into Jax, then you would probably still continue to get results out of him. If you haven't, I also wouldn't really recommend him, but I wouldn't recommend against him. I think he's just there as a pretty solid option at the moment. Nasus, great for lower MMR brackets. He's relatively simplistic in the way he wants to function. Very strong mid game. Not quite the immense late game scaler, which he's like commonly perceived as, but can still definitely be one of a really good late game options. But yeah, the play around your mid game, you're like level 9 to like 13, even all the way to like 18 is usually where Nasus as a champion really shines, being able to just outright stat check most champions on side, be very powerful in team fights if ahead of the curve. I don't like Ornn that much at the moment, mainly for the fact that I think tanks just relatively low agency, and I think leaning towards lower agency can be a big, it's a pretty punishing factor if you are like looking to consistently climb. If you're not confident in your ability to take over games, so then I think tanks are a relatively good way to kind of opt into if you're confident in someone else's ability to either carry the game, or you have like the tools in your team which you like can follow up on. I think then Ornn can work as a really nice option. I don't recommend him as an A tier pick, but I think as a B tier pick, he's a pretty fine option. Scales relatively well, has great setup for your team with the ultimate, and yeah, I'd say he's a pretty solid B tier pick. Kali, great counter pick option. If you're looking for an APSS in the top lane, Kali can work really nicely for you. I think she fits in as a really good B tier option. Kind of like Yasuo, where I think they're both really good mid laners, but work nicely as top lane options in the right spots as well. Aurelia sits towards the high end of the B tier. I don't know what to do with Aurelia at this point. I think if you play her, then you're going to continue to play her, and she probably gets good results for you. If you don't play Aurelia at the moment, I don't really recommend the champion. I don't think she's that insanely overpowered, that you can kind of get away with it, but in the right spots, then the champion's good. I think she can work really nicely as a counter pick, and if you have her within your pool, you can probably play her every so often and get good results. If you don't, I wouldn't recommend starting. I think she's probably in she's in a very average spot at the moment. Camille sits within the B tier. She's also fine. Like, I think if you play her already, then you'll probably continue to play her, but kind of reliant on being a counter pick at the moment. She's definitely not in one of her strongest spots. It can be quite oppressive if like played against certain matchups where she can really like find the edge and then snowball on sides, for example. Especially if you pair alongside a jungler, which works really nicely with her ultimate. Sylas sits within the B tier. I think Sylas, kind of akin to Akali, kind of akin to Yasuo, in the right spots in the top lane, can be a very strong pick at the moment. Definitely suffer from the thrower nerfs, but I think Protobelt looks really good on him, and you can even opt into like Grasp and some even like, I see some AD variations. I wouldn't recommend going the AD variations, but they do exist. They float around. If you want to try them out, you can, but primarily you are just playing him on either Roa or Protobelt. I think the champion's in a pretty solid spot at the moment, especially as a counter pick. Mundo, I'm going to put him up to the A tier. Hype around Mundo's interesting, because this champion wasn't very hyped, and then Aloy started playing a lot of Mundo, and then the champion became, I would even say, overhyped as an option. I think he's good for solo queue. He can struggle into certain team compositions, and obviously he's relatively simplistic to play. But a lot of people need to remember, Alois is one of the best top laners on the server. This champion, if you put him in the hands, or like any champion for the most part, if you put them in the hands of someone who's incredibly good at the game, will look pretty strong. Not to say that Mundo's like weaker or anything. I think he's good. Like, I do recommend him as an option. I just don't think he's quite like an S tier pick. I would recommend other things over him. But if you find the right angles and you're comfortable playing Mundo, then yeah, I'd promote him as a pretty solid A tier option in his current state. Being moved up to the A tier then is Ryze, who got buffed this patch and is definitely doing quite well with those buffs. He's not like a high A tier option by any means, but if you enjoy playing Ryze top, then yeah, he looks pretty promising as an option. He's been given some better like wave clear openings, especially early on into the game. The buffs carry up all the way through till like level 16, so like 6 through, I think it's even from the get-go, from like 1 till 15, for example. Ryze looks like a stronger champion, and obviously you're going to have lost some power from like the W stats, but yeah, the EQ wave clear combined with just the trading is very nice for him, and he's definitely solidified himself as a pretty good A tier option. Dropping down from the A tier are both Aatrox and Garen. Okay, so Garen, he looks weaker. I think the main takeaway, at least from what I've seen and like observed from his builds, are crit builds do, in fact, look weaker. I mean, this was like the intention with the changes. AD options later on into his build look a bit more promising. So what was like Strikebreaker PD into like Deadman's core, or like Infinity Edge, and then like continued damage core. Looks a bit weaker, but if you're going into like Shojin, or you're going into a Sterix or a Cleaver later on into the build, it definitely looks a bit more promising as an option. I think he is slightly under the bar at the moment, which is why I've been within the beta. But with buffs, I do think this champion can definitely find a better footing, and probably a healthier footing than he was in 15.10. Don't be surprised if you see Garen buffs in 15.12. I do think he's under the bar at the moment. Also moving down is Aatrox. I don't think Aatrox is moving quite as far down as Garen. I think he probably sits in the middle of the beta at the moment. But the nerfs are substantial. Right, okay. So the main takeaways are, so the passive nerf is meaningful. He's no longer going to sustain as much later on into the game. The Q sweet spot damage amp is meaningful because you are going to do more damage across the game and heal more through doing that damage, and damage, like just opting into more damage, is going to be more meaningful. And the W being changed from magic to physical promotes lethality purchases. I think the biggest takeaway from these changes are lethality Aatrox is probably the best way to go again. It's not very popular at the moment. Most people are still defaulting into like the Bruiser variants, or like the Eclipse variant, where you go like Eclipse into Bruiser, or you go Shojin or Sundered Sky into like Bruiser variants. I recommend trying Cyclo Sword, Profane Hydra again, Edge of Night again. Just give these items a try. See if you can like really make this champion snowball quite aggressively, as I do think that is probably in a lot of scenarios going to be the best way to play him. Obviously, Bruiser Aatrox I still think has good spots, but it's going to be a bit of time before people readjust, because these changes are meaningful and they do shift his builds like a genuine amount. Moving up from the B tier to the A tier is Fiora. I think I've been a bit how would I describe it? Being a bit lenient on Fiora. I don't think Fiora was a B tier champion. I think Fiora probably is an A tier, maybe even competitive S tier champion. I think a lot of my judgment of this champion came from the fact that Fiora is a hard champion to play. I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. But the genuine power that this champion currently holds, the like polarizing matchups, the fact that I think PTA Fiora is genuinely one of the best champions in the game at the moment, and most people still opt into Grasp or Conqueror as default. I think Fiora really should be played more. I do think she's probably a competitive S tier option. I'm going to leave her at the high end of the A tier at the moment, as for the same reason why I left her in the B tier for a while. She is a genuinely hard champion to play, and you need to put time to her. But Fiora, in Elite especially, I think she's up there as one of the best champions you can go to at the moment. Remaining within the A tier, we have the likes of Sam, who is just a bit too low agency to really recommend as anything higher. I think as a blind top lane pick, especially in competitive, he is probably the best tank option to go to. I play a lot of Sion. In fact, I'll probably end up playing Sion in my next competitive series if he is left open, because this champion is just the best way to go, or like for that kind of style of play. Blue side, like blind top, Sion, always going to be a champion I recommend. For Solo Kivo, he is low agency. You are not going to get as much, you're not going to be able to control the game as much when you're opting into something like Sam over a champion like Fiora, for example. The main thing is, yeah, he's just a bit easier to play, and yeah, he's a tank. So take with that what you will. I think he still sits as a solid A2 option though, and yeah, he's going to remain here as a pick. And you can even opt into like AD options, like your Titanics, your Hullbreakers, your Sterix, your Overlord Bloodmails can all be quite nice on him, especially later on into the game. Trundle sits within the A tier. Played against, I played Yorick Trundle the other day, and that matchup is completely unplayable for Yorick, as I found out. I haven't ran into Trundle for a while. This pick is relatively, like, popular within lower MMR. Well, I say popular. He is more played within lower MMR brackets. He is very stat-checky. He's good into AD matchups. He's good into tank matchups for the most part. I do think he's a good top laner, if anything, a better top laner than he is a jungler. And he is seeing jungle play again, which is quite interesting to see, especially within the current meta with, like, your Xin Zhaos, some of your tankier options. Trundle definitely on the rise at the moment. Sits within the A tier as a pretty solid A tier option. I'd say he's probably a mid to high end A tier option at the moment. Pantheon has been doing fine. Well, I say fine. He's been doing good within the top lane, like for a while now. I had him, I think, close to the S tier for a while. Then I had him towards the higher end of the A tier, and then I have him as more like a mid A tier option. I think he probably sits within the realm of mid A tier. I still think he's a better mid laner and jungler than top laner. But he does have really, really polarizing matchups. And if you can play the advantages on this champion, I do think he is in a very good spot at the moment. So I do recommend him as an option. Quinn, We saw Quinn in the LR game today, which was quite funny. I do think people sleep on Quinn considerably. This champion has an insane amount of burst within her kit. Maybe too much burst. I do think Riot should probably adjust that. I don't think Quinn should be a fly-in, one-shot you fly-away champion. I think she should have some level of extended trading patterns, otherwise she does become a bit unhealthy for the game. Yeah, I'd say she's a solid A tier option. If you play Quinn at the moment, you're probably chilling. Like, I think Quinn is in a good spot. Vladimir sits within the A tier. I'll be interested to see how Horizon Focus Vladimir does this patch. I do think it looked decent last patch, and the buffs to this patch really help him. So I wouldn't even be surprised if something like Horizon Focus Rush Vladimir comes up as an option soon, or like as a second item option, as it can be like a competitive second slot purchase alongside like Rabadons, for example, as it gives him a lot of AP, relatively similar to Rabadons. It's like it's like smaller Rabadons, it's cheaper, gonna give you a little less AP, but does have 25 haste on it, which is great for Vladimir. Vladimir loves haste. Kennen sits within the A tier. Kennen is a unique champion. He's not that popular, but I think in the spots where he's good and like people play him, he's an incredibly frustrating champion to play against. He has so much harass within his kit. It's really hard to lock him down. He's good scaling. He has a lot of tools, and I do think Kennen is a relatively slept-on champion at the moment. That being said, First Strike isn't that great of a rune at the moment. Leandre got nerfed, and that does hurt him in certain matchups where you did oftentimes opt into that combo. That being said, though, Protobelt got buffed, and that was his like main core item. So Kennen, I do think he's a deserving A tier option. If you play Kennen, then you're probably doing quite well at the moment. This champion is definitely in a good spot. We even saw the mid-lane Kennen player do really, really well in Korea. I keep forgetting his name. Look him up. This champion's in a good spot. Clyde sits within the A tier. He's a pretty niche option, but I do think he's relatively perform at the moment. You can opt into like some of those more bruisery builds, but I believe lethality still tends to be his traditional core at the moment. The pick, yeah, does an insane amount of damage. You need to push early though. If you fall behind, this champion definitely does struggle compared to other options, and you do want to put time into him. I don't recommend him as a pick, but if you already play him, then yeah, he sits as a solid A tier option. Alongside like your higher middings and your Wukongs, they're pretty niche, but they can all be very explosive in their own manner, especially if you play a lot of them. I don't recommend them as options, but if you do already play them, then you are probably doing quite well for yourself. Darius, I'm probably going to put Darius towards the lower end of the A tier now. He's not doing quite as well at the moment, albeit he's still an incredibly hard champion for a lot of champions to play against. He can be very oppressive early onto the game. His scaling isn't bad. He does recurve back up later onto the game, especially if you just get consistent ultimate takedowns. So I do think he's a decent option. I'd still say he's a low A tier pick. He's just not quite as performant. Direct nerfs to his kit have definitely left him in a bit of a weaker spot at the moment, but still above the bar in his current state. Riven sits within the A tier. I'm going to have Riven next to Fiora. These two champions, if you play them a lot, you probably already know they're very good picks to lean into at the moment. Especially in Elite, these two picks probably sit as like one of the top 5 options you can go to at the moment. For average play though, they're a bit harder to play, which is why I don't really recommend them as much, but if you want to learn them, you want to put the time into them, and you have put the time into them, then they can be great options to go to in their current states. Some of your more unique options are like your Singe, which I do think sits within the A tier at the moment. The pick has been adjusted a couple of times recently. They want to keep him as like a pretty above the bar champion because that's how he maintains his audience. They also kind of alleviated some rules around his poison, making it so he's not as needing to proxy with the poison. If minions last hit a minion with poison on it, it now counts as a last hit with your poison ticks, which gives you the CS credit, which is very nice for him, especially in non-proxy scenarios. So I do think he sits as an A tier option at the moment, but he's definitely niche, and he sits with like your other niche A tier options. Teemo, I think, is a good counter pick. He's definitely lower MMR skewed at the moment. He scales really well, and that's definitely a big strength for the champion. They've kind of pushed him away from being as oppressive of a lane bully, but if you can play him well, then I still think he can definitely function as a lane bully, especially like up all the way till like high diamond master, where people won't really respect you as much. Once you go diamond plus, yeah, you're going to start you're not going to be given those angles quite as consistently, which is why you have to kind of rely a bit more on your scaling and then playing around your shrooms, making sure you're playing the map correctly. Poppy sits within the A tier. I think as a counter pick, she's a great option. Don't think Blind Poppy's that good though. Yeah, that's kind of my thing with Poppy at the moment. She's definitely been pushed more towards her scaling with the changes she received not too long ago to kind of push her out of support, but I think she can still be a very valuable pick in all three roles, in fact, jungle, top, and support for that matter. Renekton sits within the A tier. If you're looking for the good old jack of all trades champion, I think Renekton is great in his current state. He got buffed not too long ago. The buffs helped his scaling again. In fact, I think Renekton's scaling isn't even bad these days. They've done a lot to kind of push him away from being an early game bully. I think people would have remembered, the people who played a while ago remember the old times of Renekton where he could literally just run PTA and stat check you throughout the first 5 levels of the game, and then would be useless after like level 11 for the most part. Like, this champion really aggressively fell off, but yeah, doesn't do that so much anymore. So I think Renekton, a great champion for solo queue in his current state. Wrapping up the A tier, then we have Zac, Cassiopeia, and Mordekaiser. I have Zac towards the high end of the A tier, as I do think this champion is pretty slept on as a top lane pick, but tends to be a bit more counter pick reliant, which is why I have him next to Poppy. I think both these are great counter pick tank champions. I mean, Poppy's more of a tank / bruiser now, although Zac can do like bruiser-esque level damage, so that can be quite funny. Cassiopeia sits towards the high end of the A tier as well. I don't think she's quite as good anymore. Definitely suffered from the Seraph and the Roa nerfs, so I don't have her as like an S tier option, but in the right spots, and if you already play her, she's an incredible pick. Definitely deserving of a solid A tier option. I have her next to the other more niche picks because she's not quite as common in the top lane anymore. That being said, like, Anivia is a comparable champion. I think Anivia is incredibly overpowered in the top lane. I don't have her on here because she's incredibly unpopular within the top lane, but she's very powerful in her current state. And then Mordekaiser was the last one. I think Mordekaiser is great for like mid to lower MMR brackets, but definitely does struggle considerably more the higher up you go. Like Diamond Plus, this champion does definitely fall off in terms of power, but yeah, for climbing the ranks, for going from like gold to like your emeralds, I think Mordekaiser is one of the best options, and I will still continue to recommend him as a good AP Juggernaut pick. Dropping down from the S tier to the A tier is Cho'Gath. He got nerfed this patch, and it was meaningful. Losing armor growth on Cho'Gath does have more impact than like losing armor growth on like Annie, for example, who also lost armor growth this patch, because Cho'Gath is a very big health stacker, and to go alongside health you want like good base armor and base magic resist stats. If you don't, then that health will oftentimes get chewed through by like percentage health damage, so that can be very meaningful. But the nerfs, yeah, they were 0.5 armor off of him. It does matter. It moves him from the S tier to the A tier. I still think he's a great scaling tank pick though, especially if you are looking for an option within that vein. The S tier then. What do we lead off with? I'll lead off with Warwick. I think Warwick is still an incredibly abusive early game champion. You do have to pilot him well though. If you don't, you will oftentimes not get the advantages you need and then struggle to close out games, which can be punishing. So I don't recommend him as much as some of the other options, but if you already play him, he's a great pick. Olaf, great counter pick option, has incredibly large amounts of damage within his kit, and into certain compositions, he can be Exodia for the most part. I really do recommend him as a champion, and just having him within your pool can be a really big like threat, especially if you're playing like in competitive, or you're playing for like champ pool value. I think he's definitely one of the best options out there. I think Kayle sits within the S tier still. Well, I say still. I'm dropping her from the S plus to the S tier. She still benefited from the item buffs massively, like the Nashor, Rabadon, Lichbane buffs were huge for her, and she probably sits towards the high end of the S tier, but not quite like the standalone S plus option, which I would have, which I thought she might have become with those item buffs. She's still a great S tier pick though, definitely one of the promo options. Yorick sits within the S tier, incredibly obnoxious champion to play against in the right matchups. He is incredibly polarizing. Being most champions can't deal with the ghouls anymore because they take too much, they're too tanky. Like your Argot, for example, really struggles in the Yorick matchup. That being said though, I still think Argot is one of the premier S tier options to lean into at the moment. He's in a very good spot. Shen has definitely been overloaded with buffs now and sits within the S tier. He's not going to quite have as much agency as like a raw carry, but the fact that his ultimate is an incredibly powerful global tool does give him genuine like agency threat for like a tank, which is not as common. Like, you are not going to see that with a lot of the other tanks. And with Set, the most popular champion in Gold Plus still, I think Set very much fits with the S tier options. The itemization has, Overlord's Blood Mail buffs were really nice for him, enables him to even opt into it as a second option, but it looks to be just outright his best third option, and is a very, very good bruiser to lean into in his current state. I'm losing my voice, but those are my thoughts. I really do recommend the S tier options if you're looking for champions to climb from like Gold to Master, but a lot of the A and the B tier options can be really good to lean into if you're very, very comfortable on those champions. Thank you guys for watching, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.